Following the fall of Rangoon, after a few days of rest and reorganization, in the second half of March 1942, the Japanese 15th Army was on the move again, heading north, determined to surround and annihilate British forces in central Burma. As their reinforcements arrived steadily over Rangoon port, the Japanese planned to advance with 3 divisions north, along separate axes of advance. The 33rd Division was to move along the Irrawaddy Valley, aiming to take Prome and Yenangyanug oil fields, while in the center, the 55th Division was to drive up the Sitang Valley, over the Rangoon-Mandalay Road through Meiktilo. On the right flank of advance, the newly arrived 56th Division was to move east to the vicinity of Tongji, and head north toward Lashio. The 18th Division, upon arrival, was to remain in reserve in the Sitang Valley, where it could react to assist any of the 3 advancing divisions if needed. In front of them, the Allies prepared to defend the 2 valley routes leading north, along the Irrawaddy and Sitang rivers into the heart of Burma, on a 130 km long front, running from Prome to Tungu. In late March, the British forces pulled back from Tharawadi to Prome, a small town on the eastern bank of the Irrawaddy River, where they concentrated their defences along the Irrawaddy Valley, aiming to defend the Yenangyaung oil fields, the only remaining source of petrol and engine oil available, for recently established Boer Corps, under the command of General William Slim, while newly arrived divisions of the 5th Chinese Army centered their defences around Tungu in the Sitang Valley, protecting the other route running up the Rangoon-Mandalay Road. To make matters worse, it was not only the 15th Army that received reinforcements. The Japanese 5th Air Division, which provided air support to ground forces from the beginning of the invasion of Burma, commanded by Lieutenant General Hideyoshi Obata, was also reinforced with the 7th and 8th Air Brigades, transferred from Malaya and the Dutch East Indies, giving it total strength of 420 aircraft. Against them stood a small Allied air force, consisting of a few Blenheim bombers, a small number of P-40 fighters of Flying Tigers, and Hurricanes of the Royal Air Force's 17th Squadron, which arrived in Burma in late January. The Allied air power decreased steadily over the past 2 months, not so much as a result of constant air combat, but mainly due to a lack of spare parts and dust on the poor runways, which caused frequent engine failures. After the fall of Rangoon, what was left of the Allied Air Force had to be withdrawn into central Burma, and split into 2 mixed wings, one at airfields at Magwa, and one at Akyab. Nevertheless, despite the modest resources, on March 21, 9 Blenheims escorted by 10 Hurricanes, carried out a daring air raid on a massive concentration of Japanese aircraft, in the airfields around Rangoon. Although the raid achieved some success, it also triggered immense Japanese retaliation. On the same day and on March 22, the Japanese planes repeatedly bombed poorly defended Magwa airfield, rendering runways unusable and destroying many fighters and bombers on the ground. The few remaining Hurricanes and Blenheims withdrew to Akyab airfield, which came under attack the following day, with a similar result. Having lost the usable air bases, the handful of surviving P-40s of Flying Tigers flew north to Lashio, and the remaining airworthy RAF aircraft withdrew to India, depriving Allied forces of any air support for the rest of the campaign, and giving the Japanese a complete command of the air over southern and central Burma. At about the same time, a ferocious battle began on the approaches to Tungu. On March 21, the lead elements of the Japanese 55th Division, advancing up the Sitang Valley from Pegu, encountered Chinese patrols of the 200th Division from the Chinese 5th Army, in front of a heavily fortified outpost position at Okwin, some 20 kilometers south of Tungu, from where the Chinese had fought a series of delaying actions. The 200th was the strongest of all Chinese divisions in Burma, and the only one which was close to divisional strength, armed and equipped with American-made small arms and artillery. The heavily entrenched Chinese forces of the 559th Regiment managed to hold and inflict heavy casualties on the Japanese spearhead for a few days, until March 24, when they withdrew towards Tungu. On the same day, the Japanese 143rd Regiment swung westwards around the town, overrunning the nearby airfield and cutting off the 200th Division from outside support to the west, while in the meantime, the 112th Regiment advanced up the road towards Tungur from the south. The following day the 55th Division launched an attack on the town, where they encountered stubborn resistance from the well-dug-in Chinese, who fought the Japanese to a standstill at a high cost. A series of direct infantry assaults on the town, supported by heavy artillery and bombers, carried out by increasingly exhausted troops of the 55th Division, continued for days, in which the Japanese had become engaged in fierce house-to-house fighting, while failing to make ground against determined Chinese defenders. Seeing that the 55th Division could not take Tungu alone, the 15th Army commander, General Shojiro Ida, sent the newly deployed 56th Division to their aid. On March 28, the reconnaissance regiment of the 56th Division crossed the Sitang River and swung east around the town, nearly overrunning 200th Division's headquarters and threatening their last line of supply. With the arrival of fresh Japanese troops, and considering that the unenthusiastic attack south, carried out by the Chinese 22nd Division on the same day, with the objective of relieving pressure on the 200th Division at Tungu, failed, the badly battered 200th Division, besieged for over a week, now had little option but to withdraw from the burning town, which it did by the early hours of March 30. Furthermore, in addition to losing almost half of the infantry, the 200th Division was forced to leave most of their heavy equipment, guns and trucks behind, while at the same time, failing to destroy the bridge over the Sitang River, allowing the 56th Division to quickly advance eastwards, exploiting a good network of roads leading towards Lashio. Meanwhile, in the south, the Japanese took actions to consolidate their control of the Bay of Bengal, in an effort to secure safe sea passage to Rangoon and establish a springboard for further attack on Ceylon, when on March 23, one infantry battalion from the 18th Division landed on Andaman Island, and captured the city of Port Blair without resistance, as the 300-men-strong Indian garrison surrendered, as soon as Japanese troops arrived. This action allowed the arrival of the first reinforcements by sea to Rangoon, and the first to arrive was the 213th Infantry Regiment of the Japanese 33rd Division. Now in full strength, and accompanied by a large number of Burmese rebels, in late March, the 33rd Division pushed northwards up the Irrawaddy Valley, towards Prome. The first operations against the positions held by Boer Corps in the Irrawaddy Valley began on March 26, when the Japanese commenced the air raid on Prome that destroyed 3/4 of the town. The following day, the patrols of leading elements of the 33rd Division made contact with Boer Corps as they neared its outskirts. The approach of Japanese forces provided an opportunity for General Alexander to take offensive action in order to relieve pressure on the Chinese Fifth Army, which at this time was heavily engaged around Tungu. After the Japanese advance guard attacked the 17th Division Reconnaissance Unit, east of the Irrawaddy on March 28, Alexander ordered the 17th Division's commander, Brigadier David Cowan, to move into offensive and try to reoccupy village of Ponged, and advance further to the village Okpo, both on the main road and railway line, some 40 and 80 kilometers south of Prome. Cowan gathered the strongest force he could make mobile, consisting of the 7th Hussars of the 7th Armoured Brigade, and 3 infantry battalions of the 17th Indian Division, led by Brigadier John Anstice, the 7th Armoured Brigade's commander. In the early hours of March 29, a column of Stuart light tanks and trucks with infantry advanced quickly southwards, until they reached Ponged, held by 2,000 Japanese. The initial attack on Ponged achieved limited success, as the British troops inflicted heavy casualties on the Japanese defenders and entered the village, only to be driven out of it again. However, as it happened before, the Japanese again implemented familiar tactics of establishing roadblocks in the British rear, when, on the same day, the 2nd Battalion of the 215th Regiment had swung from the western bank of the Irrawaddy, and established a strong roadblock in Shuang, only 15 kilometers south of Prome, thus cutting off Brigadier Anstice's only withdrawal line. And so, once again, the British found themselves in a situation almost identical to that of their retreat from Rangoon. For the following 24 hours, fierce fighting took place, as Anstice detached part of his troops to clear the roadblock, while the remainder attacked Pawned in the opposite direction, and found it heavily defended. Since repeated attacks from the south failed to break through the determined Japanese defenders on the roadblock, on March 30th, a desperate Anstice abandoned efforts to take Pawned, and ordered his men to break out north through a roadblock in the burning village of Shuang, in small groups, leaving behind 10 Stuart tanks and plenty more vehicles, as well as other, desperately needed heavy equipment. Some 400 men were lost, and understandably the morale further dropped. On the evening of April 1st, the Japanese 33rd Division attacked Prome and penetrated the defences held by the 63rd Indian Brigade, securing the high ground south of the town. However, by that time, Wavell, Alexander, and Slim agreed that the town's defence was untenable, and given recent difficulties, along with the fatigue of the troops of the 17th Division, a withdrawal from Prome should commence at once towards Yenangyang, 160 kilometers north, in order to cover the nearby oil fields, the only remaining area in Burma worth defending. On April 2nd, the 17th Division began withdrawing north and northeast of Prome in good order. Following a series of delaying actions, on April 3rd, the 17th Division moved through the 1st Burma Division, and by April 8th, Burkorps began occupying a new defensive line, in the area known as Dry Zone, where the country was more open and more suitable for the employment of tanks, instead of being thickly covered by jungle, running from Minla on the right bank of Irrawaddy River, to Taungwingyi. This new front line, anchored on the Irrawaddy River in the west, around Minla, held by the 1st Burma Division and stretched to Taungwingyi, defended by the 17th Indian Division, was over 65 kilometers wide, so as a consequence, there was no way to form a defense in depth. Therefore, General Alexander requested that General Tu Yu-ming, commander of the Chinese Fifth Army, deploy one regiment to hold Taungwingyi, to enable Burkorps to form a reserve. Given the small size of the Chinese army units, and after further consideration, Alexander requested General Ming to send him at least one division to hold Taungwingyi. General Ming granted his request, promising to put the entire division at Burkorps' disposal. Unfortunately, this promise never came true. As the first days of April passed, the stage slowly became set for one of the fiercest battles of the campaign. And although Japanese aircraft now enjoyed complete air superiority, ranged freely over Burma, bombing and strafing Allied troops, road, rail and river communications at will, an indisputable fact was that, unlike previous engagements, when the Japanese held an advantage in men and heavy equipment, this time, only one Japanese division advanced against two British divisions, and most certainly, they held no numerical advantage. Even though these two British divisions have been worn out and suffered heavy losses, the Japanese 33rd Division was no less exhausted. Yes, maybe the Japanese had been accompanied by a certain number of Burmese insurgents, but the combat quality of these troops was at the very least questionable. The first engagements of the battle for Yenangyang began on April 10, when the lead columns of the 33rd Division came in contact with British patrols southwest of Taungwingyi. The following day, a Burkorps striking force, consisting of the 48th Brigade, reinforced with elements of the 7th Armoured Brigade, moved south to attack the most easterly of these columns. Early in the morning of April 12, the British forces established contact with the advancing Japanese of the 213th Regiment, which had been coming forward fanatically and in strength. Following bitter fighting, the British forces ended up pressured hard, and the 48th Brigade, after suffering heavy losses, barely held its ground to the extent that withdrawal from Taungwingyi was considered an option. Even though the Chinese division hadn't arrived on time as promised, and regardless of the difficult situation the 17th Division was in, General Slim ordered them to hold Taungwingyi at all costs, believing that the loss of the town would endanger the line of communication with the Chinese armies to the east. Meanwhile, farther west, the 1st Burma Division came under even heavier attack by the 215th Regiment of the 33rd Division. The onslaught continued in the following days, as the Japanese pressed on with an assault that had swayed the line back and forward, in attacks and counter-attacks, frequently ending in fierce hand-to-hand fighting, and gradually, by April 14, both the 1st Burma Division and the 48th Brigade were pushed back, causing a wide gap to appear between the two divisions, allowing the Japanese 214th Regiment to infiltrate unnoticed, deep into the British rear, where they established what else but another roadblock. In addition to the 214th Regiment, all along the front, the other Japanese units and Burmese insurgents also attempted to infiltrate behind British lines, often wearing Burma Rifles uniforms, or dressed as civilians, causing much confusion on the battlefield. This kind of chaotic combat was most prominent in the sector held by the 1st Burma Brigade, which desperately struggled to defend the road leading to Yenangyang on the left bank of Irrawaddy, frequently engaging the Japanese parties coming from all directions, until they finally fell back under pressure, leaving the 215th Regiment a clear way towards Magw some 15 kilometers north, where the Burma Corps established its headquarters. Without a clear understanding of what was happening on the front, but pretty confident that the Japanese were preparing a strong push on the oil fields, General Slim committed his last reserve, the remnants of the 2nd Battalion, the King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry, and the Cameronians, who were by then also only a skeleton battalion, supported by the tanks of the 2nd Royal Tank Regiment, with the task of delaying the Japanese advance until the 1st Division withdraw north, while at the same time he ordered the destruction of oil wells and refineries at Yenangyang. At 1 p.m. on April 15, 1942, powerful explosions ignited millions of gallons of crude oil that went up in flames that rose over 100 meters high, covering the entire area with thick black smoke. In this apocalyptic scenery, under intense heat, suffering from water shortages, the 1st Burma Division was withdrawing north along the Magw-Yenangyang Road, covered by the Burma Corps Reserve, when, on April 17, they ran across roadblocks, set by the Japanese forces from the 214th Regiment, immediately north of Yenangyang, that cut off their line of retreat. Pursued from the south by the 215th Regiment, the 1st Burma Division soon ended up surrounded. And once again, the fate of the weak British forces in Burma hung in the balance, as the wild and confusing battle, full of ambushes, attacks and counterattacks erupted, with the British troops having to fight off Japanese forces coming from all directions, which prevented them from making the breakthrough to the north. Amid this confusion, the Japanese seized Yenangyang after surprising the garrison stationed there. As the situation quickly became critical, Alexander again asked Stilwell for urgent help, and on April 17, the two leading regiments of the Chinese 38th Division arrived from Mandalay. Each regiment had approximately only 800 combat personnel, and had no artillery or tank support. Therefore, Slim placed the Chinese division under his command, reinforcing them with the few remaining tanks of the 2nd Royal Tank Regiment, and the little artillery he had available, assigning them to clear the Japanese roadblock, by attacking from the north at dawn on April 18. At the same time, the 1st Burma Division was to attack from the south. Meanwhile, the Japanese 213th Regiment broke contact with the 17th Division at Taungwingyi, in order to attack the 1st Burma Division from the east. Now unmolested by the Japanese, the 17th Division, although firmly held its ground, was still in severe danger, exposed on both flanks, as it became evident that the Japanese were not pressing it, but were bypassing it from both sides. At 6:30 a.m. on April 18, the attack on the roadblocks began, when the 1st Burma Division launched the attack from the south, soon joined by the 38th Chinese Division, advancing from the north. The fierce battle in the blazing sun raged all day, but the Allies failed to penetrate Japanese defenses, often held to the last men, and the attack soon came to a standstill. To relieve the pressure on the 214th Regiment, the other two regiments of the 33rd Division increased the pressure from the south and east against the remainder of the 1st Burma Division. By then, highly desperate General James Bruce Scott, the 1st Burma Division's commander, requested permission to abandon his tanks, vehicles and seriously wounded, and break out of the encirclement that same night. Slim, however, refused his request without hesitation, leaving Scott no choice but to group his division and form an all-round defensive perimeter. Following a stressful, but generally quiet night, at 7 a.m. on April 19, the 13th Indian Infantry Brigade attacked the roadblock again, but once more met heavy resistance. Throughout the day, the 1st Burma Division fought alone, as the Chinese attack from the north, scheduled to begin in the morning, failed to materialize after being constantly delayed. While the heat exhaustion, Japanese artillery and aircraft claimed an increasing toll of lives, and as the situation became desperate, in the afternoon, a squadron of tanks attached to the 1st Burma Division had found a clear, but rough track leading east. Scott wasted no time and formed his division into a column, spearheaded by tanks and infantry, and began to pull back along this way, bypassing the Japanese roadblock. The narrow, uneven path proved impassable for wheeled vehicles, which had to be abandoned along the way, and the wounded carried in them had to be piled on the tanks, while the infantry carried out on foot. By nightfall, the dispirited remnants of the 1st Burma Division, having lost approximately 1,000 dead, wounded and missing, have reached the safety behind the Chinese lines, several kilometers north of the Yenangyaung. And once again, the British forces narrowly escaped almost certain destruction. In its first major engagement against the Japanese, the 1st Burma Division had lost about 20% of its personnel, and was not in a fit condition to fight, without reorganizing for some days. At the same time, while the British troops made their way along the rough path, at 3 p.m., the Chinese finally resumed the attack, and supported by British Stuart tanks, they penetrated the Japanese defenses, and advanced as far as Yenangyaung itself, from where they withdrew on April 20, after having rescued a number of British captives. While the Battle of Yenangyaung still raged on, the Japanese attacked the Chinese 5th and 6th Armies in the east. Following the withdrawal of the Chinese 200th Division from Tungu, on April 1, the 5th Army withdrew north towards Pyonmana, where with its 3 divisions, held a comparatively narrow front in great depth, blocking the way through the Sitang Valley. This area was relatively quiet until April 7, when the Japanese 55th Division, now reinforced with lead elements of the 18th Division, advanced from Tungu and attacked the 22nd Division near the village of Yadash. In the heavy fighting which followed, the 22nd Division suffered severe casualties, until it was finally relieved by the 96th Division on April 18. The following day on April 19, the 55th Division entered Pyonmana, where they were relieved by the fresh troops of the 18th Division, which took over the further advance north. The fighting around Pyonmana was the main reason why General Meng ignored Alexander's request to send a division to take over Taungwingyi. Considering Burkorp's defeat at Yenangyaung on their right flank and the problems faced by the 6th Chinese Army in their left flank, the hard-pressed divisions of the 5th Army had to withdraw back towards Meiktilo, which they did in considerable disorder. In general, divisions of the 5th Chinese Army, especially the 22nd, had fought well, but the Japanese infiltrating tactics had been too much for them. At about the same time, the 56th Division quickly swept through the Shan states in northeast Burma, held by the 6th Chinese Army. In the first days of April, the 56th Division began pushing the weak Chinese 55th Division north, until April 16, when after a series of outflanking movements and heavy casualties on both sides, the Japanese encircled the unfortunate Chinese division, which ended up overrun and scattered. Over the next few days, fast-moving Japanese forces increasingly pressed the rapidly disorganized 6th Chinese Army towards the Salween and Thai frontier. To relieve pressure on the 6th Army, on April 21, General Stilwell ordered and personally led a counterattack carried out by the 200th Division, on the left flank of the Japanese advance, which began well, when Chinese troops, after 3 days of vicious combat, recaptured Taungyi on April 24, and advanced further east, driving back the Japanese 113th Regiment, but the attack soon lost momentum, as the 200 Division had to disperse its forces, becoming engaged simultaneously in offensive and defensive battle. Having secured its left flank, the 56th Division continued with an advance, and on April 29, its 148th Regiment entered Lashio, after almost completely destroying the Chinese 6th Army, which had been dispersed in just 2 weeks of combat, with its battered remnants made their way back to China. Fortunately for the Chinese, on April 24, General Ida ordered the 56th Division to halt on the line on the Salween River, instead of continuing, virtually unopposed, into Yunnan province in China, while some divisions' units swung northwest, aiming to cut the other land routes to China, and destroy remaining Allied forces in central Burma. This unfortunate turn of events for the Allies was too much for Alexander. Besides, the Japanese successes against Chinese armies disrupted his plans to mount an offensive against the Japanese 33rd Division in the Yenengyang area, while at the same time, Burkorps ammunition and other supplies were running dangerously low, and malaria, in combination with exhaustion, began to take their toll. Therefore, he had no other option but to acknowledge that further defense of Burma was no longer possible with his shattered formations, and he was left to decide whether to retreat his forces to India or China. Following consultations with Wavell, Stilwell and the Chinese, on April 28, Alexander ordered Slim to pull back his Burkorps to India, via the Chindwin Valley across the mountains, while the remnants of the Chinese army were either to retreat northwards or eastwards towards China. The evacuation from Burma had to be finished as quickly as possible, and completed before May 20, when the fast-approaching monsoon period was expected to break with full fury. However, with the loss of Lashio, the main land route to China had been cut off, which meant that some of the remaining Chinese forces would have to retreat alongside the Burkorps to India, while the rest should go over the hills and jungles of northern Burma. To cover the retreat of the 5th Chinese Army, which had ceased to be a fighting formation, on April 25, Slim ordered the 7th Armored Brigade and the 17th Division to pull back from Taungyi and move swiftly to Meiktilo, to take position between the retreating Chinese and the pursuing Japanese, where they successfully fought, delaying actions against advancing Japanese forces for the next few days. Once the final Chinese stragglers and civilian refugees passed through Meiktilo on April 27, the British troops withdrew in good order further north, to occupy positions south of Mandalay, aiming to protect this main road and railway junction in central Burma, with the only bridge over the Irrawaddy River. On the evening of April 30, after the bulk of Burkorps, refugees, and scattered Chinese troops were safely over the Irrawaddy, the last bridge over the river was destroyed. The following morning on May 1, the troops of the Japanese 18th Division entered Mandalay, encountering no opposition, as the British and Indian troops continued their retreat, heading west towards India, while most of the scattered Chinese troops proceeded northeast, hoping to reach China, closely pursued by the 18th Japanese Division. And while it seemed that everything was going smoothly, and that the withdrawal from Burma would pass without major problems, in utmost secrecy, the Japanese 33rd Division, for the past few days, moved quickly over the rough terrain, advancing north along the west bank of Irrawaddy, aiming to block Burkorps' escape route. On April 30, the lead elements of the 33rd Division crossed Chindwin, surprising the advancing party of the 1st Burma Division, as they neared the vicinity of Monawa, a small town on the Chindwin's eastern bank, when the Japanese raiding party overran the 1st Burma Division's headquarters, some 6 kilometers south of the town. For the next 2 days, Slim committed all he had to recapture Monawa, but failed to push the increasingly stronger Japanese defenders back, until May 2, when he finally abandoned the further attack, and decided to bypass the town and proceed cross-country, towards the next river crossing upriver, at Kailwa. The loss of Monawa was a devastating blow to the British, since it allowed the Japanese safe crossing over the Chindwin, and free passage towards Kailwa, letting them closely pursue the retreating Boer Corps. By May 8, the bulk of British forces had reached Kailwa and began crossing the Chindwin, using 6 river steamers, leaving behind all heavy equipment, including the last artillery battery, after having fired all shells, while the crews of the 7th Armoured Brigade destroyed a few remaining Stuart tanks, to deny them to the Japanese. To protect this enormous congestion of troops and vehicles at the river crossing in Kailwa, a small detachment from the 48th Indian Infantry Brigade was assigned as a rearguard and occupied positions at Shuijian village, just a few kilometers downstream, where they successfully delayed the much stronger Japanese forces for 2 days, allowing the rest of Boer Corps to cross the river, until they also broke contact with Japanese, and withdrew to safety. On that occasion, the Chinese 38th Division, which has fought well, alongside the British forces since the battle at Yenengyang, detached from the Boer Corps and proceeded north, where they crossed Chindwin upstream, arriving in India on May 24, after overcoming the high jungle-covered mountains. In the meantime, the remnants of the Chinese Fifth Army withdrew north, with the last units arriving in China by the end of June. On May 12, the first heavy rains of the monsoon broke out, and by May 18, the full fury of the monsoon rains was unleashed, just as the Boer Corps neared their final destination. The heavy rain, accompanied by floods, which lasted for months, as well as largely impenetrable mountains, had brought the Japanese advance to a halt. By that time, Imperial Japanese Army units had reached the limit of their endurance, and they also, just like the British, desperately needed the rest. Meanwhile, by May 21, the main body of Boer Corps had reached the safety of India, while scattered stragglers kept arriving for the days to come. Among these stragglers was General Stilwell, who personally led his staff of 117 men and women out of Burma into India on foot, arriving there on May 24. During 5.5 months of almost constant combat, the British and Indian forces in Burma suffered 13,463 casualties, of whom 4,033 were killed and wounded, and the remaining 9,430 were missing, while the Chinese army suffered approximately 25,000 casualties. The Japanese records show only 4,579 killed and wounded, but without a doubt, the final number of their casualties was much higher. With the arrival in India, the British forces had successfully completed what began in mid-December of 1942, a lengthy fighting retreat that covered over 1,600 kilometers, the longest withdrawal ever carried out in British history. Out of 30,000 troops that eventually reached India, most suffered from malnutrition, malaria, typhus and other tropical diseases, while only about 2,000 of them were fit for further duty, and upon arrival, many have lost weight and had grown beards, wearing worn-out boots, and ragged uniforms. To describe the men under his command, Proud Slim later wrote, "They might look like scarecrows, but they looked as the soldiers too." However, the retreat of British forces from Burma in May 1942, amidst the monsoon rains, marked just the beginning of the single longest campaign of the Second World War.